Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, it's patreon.com/the History Network. Thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 36, episode 3, The Italian Invasion of British Somaliland. This episode was written by Nicholas Mora. Nicholas is from Canada, but now lives in Boston, Massachusetts. He studied history in college and primarily focuses his reading on early 20th century military history. The Italian invasion of British Somaliland is an often overlooked action of the Second World War. Although small and a backwater of the British Empire, the region would see several significant firsts of the Second World War. The loss of the colony in mid-1940 was the first significant loss of British colonial territory during the war. The loss, alongside the few casualties suffered, caused frustration and concern in London, while the unexpected collapse of Italian East Africa less than a year later represented the first significant theaterwide defeat of the Axis powers. British Somaliland was a small colony south of the Gulf of Aden, bordering Ethiopia to its south, Italian Somalia to its east, and French Somalia to its west. Somaliland entered the British fold in the mid-1880s. The British government, while dealing with the impacts of the Mahdist revolt in Sudan and the withdrawal of Egyptian troops from the region, negotiated a series of strategic treaties with local Somali chiefs, ostensibly to prevent other powers in the Horn of Africa from gaining control of the coastal region. Authorities in London demanded that the occupation be as unintrusive as possible. Minimal British intervention in the colony was desired. Spending was to be limited to road clearance and be provided by local revenue sources, including the main port and colonial capital at Berbera. From the late 1800s to the early 1920s, the colony was embroiled in a fierce civil conflict with the so-called Mad Mullah, a local dervish who sought to oust the British from the region. Only after the intervention of a few thousand British troops, warplanes, and warships were the British able to quell the rebellion. By the 1930s, the colony's population had grown to more than 600,000, with about 60,000 at the port of Berbera alone, although this number fluctuated dramatically depending on the season. This population was nomadic, borders were poorly demarcated, and the tribes were able to travel freely across the region. Pre-war, little had changed in the colony. It was said that British Somaliland was the least valuable territory in the empire, with no railway, no bank, and no hotel. The colony was considered inhospitable, consisting of dry, rugged terrain, fierce winds, and temperatures of more than 120 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 50 degrees Celsius. The low value of the colony meant that pre-war planning and preparation were minimal until the conflict in the region seemed inevitable. The Italian presence in the region began in the late 1880s with the unified colony of Eritrea declared in 1890 and the colony of Somalia in 1908. In 1935, war had returned to the region. Italian troops had invaded Ethiopia by early May 1936. After months of brutal fighting, Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie fled through French Somalia. The next day, an Italian mechanized column entered the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa On June 1st, 1936, by royal decree, all three Italian colonies were united into a single entity called Italian East Africa, consisting of much of modern-day Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. British Somaliland was now bordered by Italian colonial possession from three sides. Conflict returned to Europe in 1939, and on June 10, 1940, Italy declared war on the United Kingdom, France, and their allies. Italian forces in East Africa were considerable, 290,000 troops split between about 200,000 native levies, 75,000 regular troops, and 17,000 border and gendarmerie troops. The Italians also had access to a small force of armoured vehicles, about 189 in total. Further, the Italians had around 200 operational and 130 reserve aircraft of various types, including several obsolete models. A small naval force was also present in Italian East Africa, consisting of 24 ships, including destroyers, submarines, and various auxiliary and supply vessels. This formidable force was under the overall command of Prince Amadeo, the Duke of Aosta. In May of 1940, just before conflict broke out in East Africa, the British had around 100 operational aircraft spread across East Africa and Yemen. Further, the Rhodesian Air Force had deployed a squadron of planes alongside 24 South African planes. By the start of the hostilities, there would be over 50 South African planes in the region. Interestingly, about a dozen of these planes consisted of Junkers Ju-86 airliners of German origin. In East Africa, these airframes would be used against German allies. In total, the Italians estimated British troop strength across East Africa to be around 200,000 troops of various quality and preparedness. By the last week of July 1940, French troops in Djibouti, to the west of British Somaliland, had surrendered. British Somaliland was now surrounded by Axis forces. After some discussion, the British Middle East commander, General Wavell, and acting command of British forces in Somaliland, Lieutenant Colonel Chater, agreed that with sufficient reinforcements the colony could be defended against Italian incursions. By the beginning of August, Chater had under his command 1st Battalion Northern Rhodesian, 2nd Battalion King's African Rifles, 1st East African Light Battery, 2 regiments of Punjabi troops, and the Somaliland Camel Corps. In early August, the 2nd Battalion of the Black Watch also joined in the defence of the colony. Chater commanded troops from across the British Empire, from Nigeria to India, of various quality, numbering 4,500 men. Air support would largely be provided by British planes stationed across the sea in Aden. A raid against them was a sizable Italian force consisting of 23 colonial battalions, 21 batteries of artillery, around 30 tanks, and additional armoured vehicles, totalling over 20,000 troops of various quality under the command of Lieutenant General Nazi. In addition, Nazi had about 60 aircraft in direct support of the invasion. The goal of any invasion of Somaliland would be the port city of Berbera. Chater would focus his defence on the port and would array most of his forces to the south of Hargeisa, at the mountain pass of Tug Argan. At Tug Argan, Chater deployed 3 of his 5 battalions and his artillery. His final battalion would act as a mobile reserve, while the irregular Camel Corps would function as screening troops against the Italian formations. The remote nature of the colony meant there were limited roads and pathways towards Berbera. The Italians planned to invade the colony using the 3 roads which connected Somaliland with its neighbours. A main column under Brigadier General de Simone would march north to seize Hargeisa, the largest inland settlement in Somaliland, and continue towards Berbera. To the east, irregulars under Brigadier General Bartello were to capture Udwain, 200 kilometers to the east of Hargeisa, and then march towards Berbera. Finally, in the west, the third column under General Bertoldi was to capture the town of Zelia and, if necessary, march towards Berbera. On August 3rd, 1940, Italian troops crossed the frontier and began skirmishing with the screening troops of the Camel Corps. In 3 days, the Western Italian column had captured Zelia, and the Eastern column had captured Udwain. Both columns then began marching towards Berbera. The main column in the centre was briefly held at bay by the skirmishing Camel Corps and an attached company of the Northern Rhodesians. On the 5th of August, after 2 days of skirmishing, the British were forced to withdraw towards Hargeisa. The poor state of the roads and unusually heavy rains forced the main Italian column to rest and refit until encountering the main British position, Tug Argan, on the 8th. During these opening skirmishes, the British, encountering Italian tanks and without sufficient anti-tank armament, were forced to press into service a 3-pounder saluting gun from the HMAS Hobart, which was stationed at Berbera. The remote and low-priority nature of the theatre meant both Italian and British units were often fighting with obsolete or repurposed equipment. As Italian intentions became clear, General Wavell appointed Major General Goodwin Austen to replace Acting Commander Chaytor and dispatched additional regiments to assist in the defence of the colony. These units would not reach the colony before its surrender. By the 11th of August, just 8 days after the invasion had begun, the central Italian column was ready to begin its attack. Tug Argan was a dried, rocky riverbed interspersed by several hills. The entire gap was about 8,000 yards in length, with the main road to Berbera driving through the gap in a northwesterly direction. Prior to the Italian arrival, the British forces had managed to create several lightly fortified positions with the assistance of Indian and Somali labourers. These positions consisted of wire trenches and pillboxes. The British lacked the forces to occupy a continuous line and instead focused on fortifying the hills within the gap. The main line consisted of 4 main positions from north to south: Black Hill, Knobbly Hill, Mill Hill, and Observation Hill. Castle Hill, to the east of Mill Hill, would act as a headquarters. Further east lay Block Hill, acting as a rear position and a block against any Italians attempting to bypass the main British line. Some 35 miles to the northeast lay Berbera. Italians would approach the British positions from the southwest. After a brief shelling, the Italians began their attack, penetrating positions between Block Hill and Castle Hill. The British managed to repulse Italian attacks on both Mill Hill and Knobbly Hill. The next day, an overall attack by the Italians pressured all significant British positions. After fierce fighting, the Italians managed to capture Mill Hill and destroy 2 of 4 British artillery pieces. During breaks in combat, small numbers of Italian aircraft launched harassing attacks and limited attacks against British logistical positions. By the night of the following day, Italian troops began to dominate the hilly positions between Castle Hill and Block Hill. Small parties of Italian troops began to infiltrate the British positions. The next day saw a brutal frontal assault against Knobbly Hill, which was again pushed back. The following morning, after heavy shelling and bombing, Italian troops again attacked Castle and Observation Hills, but both attacks were repulsed. After 4 days of fierce combat, infiltrating Italian troops were beginning to cause chaos between Block Hill and the main British defensive line. Without meaningful air or artillery support, British positions were at risk of being cut off and destroyed. A counter-attack by the King's African Rifles had attempted to push the infiltrating Italians out of their positions and achieved limited success before being repulsed. It became clear to Major General Austin that the British positions were untenable, and with no viable defensive terrain behind him, he wired Wavell's office to request a withdrawal from the colony. On the morning of the 15th, confirmation had been received, and British troops prepared to withdraw. At the same time, a fierce Italian attack had managed to capture Observation Hill and breach the main British line. It was at this location where Captain Eric Wilson would be awarded the Victoria Cross. Just 27 years old, Captain Wilson spent many years stationed across Africa. In 1939, he was assigned as second in command of the Somaliland Camel Corps. During the battle, Wilson led a group of Vickers machine guns on Observation Hill, beating back several attacks on both his position and nearby positions. So effective was the machine gun fire coming from Wilson's location that Italian forces ordered direct artillery fire from under 1,000 yards to silence his guns. Wounded severely in the right shoulder and the left eye by a shell on the 11th, Wilson continued to battle Italian attacks for 4 more days. With much of his unit dead or wounded and most guns put out of action, the Italians finally overran his position on the afternoon of the 15th, when he was presumed killed. In 1941, after the capture of Italian East Africa, Wilson was found to be alive in a prisoner of war camp. He would continue to serve His Majesty in North Africa and Burma until the end of the war, retiring as a major. Wilson died in 2008 at the age of 96, the last surviving recipient of the Victoria Cross from the Second World War. With Wilson's position overrun that night, British troops withdrew from Tug Argan, ceding the battlefield to the Italians. A block force was set up at Nezia, some 15 miles away from Berbera, which after 2 days of rest and refit, the Italians encountered on the 17th of August. Cautious Italian advances against the blocking position over the next few days allowed the British to withdraw in an orderly fashion from Berbera. By the afternoon of the 18th, a week after the Battle of Tug Argan had started, Royal Navy ships had managed to withdraw roughly 7,000 civilians and soldiers from Berbera. On the evening of the 19th, Italian troops entered Berbera, ending the campaign. In just under 2 weeks of fighting, British forces had sustained about 260 casualties, including killed, wounded and missing. Throughout the campaign, British air units, although hamstrung by limited facilities and equipment, were able to launch over 180 sorties against Italian positions, dropping almost 70 tons of bombs. 7 aircraft were lost and 10 were badly damaged. Italian casualties were much higher, estimated at around 2,000. In 13 days, Italian troops had managed to capture British Somaliland and secure the entire Horn of Africa. Just 7 months later, the colony would be back under British control, as Italian East Africa would quickly collapse to British incursions from Kenya and the Sudan. Well, thank you, Nicholas, for writing that script for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Nicholas Morrow, read by Nick Barker.